Pouvanaa te Tuapua a Oopa comes into the world on the 10th of May 1895, the year of the annexation of his island, Hawaii, in the Windward Islands. The annexing episode is far from peaceful, as the inhabitants of Hawaii lead a final brave battle against the armed forces before surrendering. Queen Tehapapa II is forced to capitulate. She hands over all her powers without reserve or restriction, or condition whatsoever, trusting in the strength, the justice, and the consideration of the Republic of France. In the early 1900s, Hawaii has no more than 1,000 inhabitants. In the village of Whare, where Pouvanaa is growing up, day-to-day life revolves around religious activities. The French authorities are merely represented by a single gendarme, who's also the school teacher. The First World War breaks out in 1914, and the French Establishments of Oceania are not spared from the fighting. The capital of Tahiti, Papeete, is bombarded on the 22nd of September 1914 by 2 German battleships. Shocked by the attack, the Tahitian population is overwhelmed by a feeling of solidarity and decides to lend a hand to the nation. The French Establishments of Oceania supply more than 1,000 men to the French army. Pouvanaa enlists as a volunteer in the Mixed Pacific Battalion, which embarks aboard the Pouvanaa on 13th of April 1917. On 7th of June 1918, the soldiers of the battalion move up to the front lines. They discover the hell of the trenches.
A horrific war devastated the world. Millions of men shed their blood defending their country.
At the end of the war, the battalion is stationed on French soil for a few months, and the young Pouvanaa observes both egalitarian and republican values, which he learns are what make the nation great. When they return to Tahiti on the 28th of June 1919, they receive a hero's welcome. Pouvanaa settles in Papeete in 1920. He has a few small jobs. He's first carpenter, then travelling salesman. He's concerned by the injustice and inequalities which are gradually decaying the small insular society, and shares his views with his war veteran friends. They realise that Tahitians have no economic or political power, and that they are becoming strangers in their own lands. His small store rapidly becomes a busy and influential place, where he perfects his talents as an orator and crowd gatherer. However, the people of the country still have no political forum.
At the time, there are no or few elections, merely district or town council elections. Political life is still at an early stage, and all decisions are down to the governor and his subordinates.
Pouvanaa becomes a public figure from 1940 onwards. Between the 2 wars, he was an electoral agent for the mayor of Papeete, Fernand Cassio, and was highly appreciated by his fellow citizens.
And then war breaks out, and he reacts undoubtedly as any war veteran would. He is saddened by the defeat of France and decides to join the fight to stop France from losing for good. So he quite naturally, I would say, joins France Libre and incites his son to go to war.
As a member of the De Gaulle Committee, Pouvanaa actively participates in rallying the French Establishments of Oceania to the France Libre resistance movement. However, problems soon arise. Some people see the war as a means of making a profit. Scandal breaks out when the population discovers that supplies are not being distributed fairly between Tahitians and expatriates.
I remember being very little, maybe about 6 or 7 years old, and being given coupons to go to the shop for milk. My mum had 8 children, that's a big family, and we were only allowed little things. Just a carton of milk or a loaf of bread. Everything arriving was reserved for, well, the civil servants, and us ordinary people had nothing, hardly anything at all.
With the support of the people, Pouvanaa gains confidence and leads an opposition movement which condemns abuse of the system within the colonial administration.
And in fact, Pouvanaa points out France's foibles by saying, "I am not the enemy of France, but I am, on the contrary, a strong advocate for the ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity."
He leads an offensive which gives the governor and state representatives cause for concern. The former patriotic soldier and friend of the nation becomes an agitator, a leader, and a troublemaker in the eyes of the authorities.
Pouvanaa is a brave man, and he is almost something of a Robin Hood figure. There's a true-to-life scene where he jumps on a cart carrying supplies of bread and milk, and with the bravery he is renowned for, he jumps onto it and distributes the bread to the population. That's Pouvanaa. Pouvanaa was a just and righteous man, and even a crusader as such.
Against this backdrop, Pouvanaa initiates a petition against those who take advantage of the war situation. Petitions, however, are prohibited in the colony, and the governor has the ultimate say. This is how, in August 1942, Pouvanaa and his friend TUATAU find themselves arrested and thrown into prison. This episode marks the beginning of Governor Orseli's campaign against him, with a succession of convictions, house arrests and forced exile.
When I heard that the High Commissioner d'Argentlieu was in Papeete, I wrote to him asking to be tried in court, to expose the reasons for our arrest on the evening of the 12th of August 1942 in Ha'apape, when we were taken into custody aboard the Lorraine, held at gunpoint and harassed with ridiculous questions with neither food nor shelter. Eight months later, I'd still not received an answer, and so we left for Bora Bora aboard an outrigger canoe in order to send a telegram to de Gaulle to inform him of the injustice we had suffered. Instead of getting an answer, and because of this escape, I was accused of wanting to sell Tahiti to the Americans. It cost me a deportation to the island of Metua.
In December 1943, 18 months after their arrest, exile ends for Pouvanaa and his friend TUATAU with a 3-month prison sentence in Papeete. Pouvanaa will later learn that members of the de Gaulle committee were responsible for his arrest, accusing him of being a revolutionary prepared to destabilize the administration and its governor. At the end of the war, France begins a series of reforms concerning her overseas territories. Thus, a political life materializes in the French Establishments of Oceania. In October 1945, Tahitians are invited to vote for the first time for their own representative to sit in the French Parliament. Pouvanaa sees this opportunity as a way of formalizing his commitment. He runs for election, but only wins a few votes against Reverend Vernier, who is a popular and widely respected figure. Political and institutional life continues to develop. In turn, the first Assembly of Representatives is established in December 1945, with 20 representatives selected by a unique electoral college.
Pouvanaa would have preferred the Assembly of Representatives to be elected at a later date. He wanted to wait for the homecoming of the country's courageous youth, the Second World War veterans still mobilized in France, who would not return before 1946. For him, it is not the upper classes who had remained in Papeete during the war who should sit on the territorial assembly, but more the valiant children of the country who had left to fight the war alongside France.
The Guitarist Battalion returns to Tahiti in January 1946. The jubilant population is proud of its heroes. As a sign of gratitude, they are promised positions in the administration. In June and November 1946, new elections are planned to finalize the constitution of the Fourth Republic. In particular, the word colony is to be removed. The French Establishments of Oceania become an overseas territory. Pouvanaa runs for election in June, but the governor Aumont orders a refusal of his right to participate in an electoral campaign. Following a legal clause relating to his judicial problems in 1942, he's stripped of his civil rights until 1950. He decides not to comply and begins campaign meetings. The governor uses the press to warn the population that Pouvanaa is ineligible. Every possible measure is taken to stop his campaign. The gendarmerie confiscates his posters, he's struck off the electoral list, and the voting slips with his name on are never printed. Despite the truncated election, more than 3,700 ballots are registered as invalid, and for many observers, these are attributed to the rejected candidate. After the elections, the battalion soldiers decide to constitute a union of volunteers to support Pouvanaa's claims and show the authorities their discontent concerning promises broken. In turn, Pouvanaa and his supporters set up the Pouvanaa Committee in February 1947, whose official objective is to fight injustice and blatant abuse of the system. Their first joint action takes place in the month of May 1947. They circulate a petition against preferential treatment.
This case is very much in line with the situation at the time, as it is announced that 3 French civil servants are due to arrive aboard a ship named La Ville d'Amiens, transporting passengers and freight from metropolitan France. Both in the Assembly and in Pouvanaa's entourage, Polynesians feel that, considering the duties of these 3 civil servants, Polynesians could easily be found to hold these positions instead.
Some 2,000 demonstrators gather on the quayside. The Union of Volunteers is at the ready. Some of them are armed. The passengers are obliged to stay on board the Ville d'Amiens.
That was his first move, on the quayside in Papeete. And from that moment on, I think he just couldn't bear to see his people being treated unfairly. I think that was Pouvanaa's ethic. He wanted his people's dignity to be respected.
A state of siege is declared, and the governor considers reinforcing the military presence. Yet at the same time, he fears a backlash from the Tahitian soldiers.
I was in the army in 1947. People went there looking for a fight. We took a speedboat, drove it right up to the ship, and took those Popa, those Europeans, on board. We took them to the Hotel Stuart. There were 2 garrisons to guard them. On one side, there were the Tahitian soldiers. On the other, French Marines. When they got off the ship, their feet didn't even touch the ground. From the speedboat to the car, and then the car to the hotel.
The colony's inspector, La Salle explicitly recommends that the governor should begin arrests. 34 people are imprisoned. 5 months later, they're tried and acquitted.
The judgment in 1947 is something of a pleasant surprise. Pouvanaa and the accused are acquitted by a lay jury. As they leave the courtroom, they are greeted by a rousing rendition of the Marseillaise from their supporters. This proves that these war veterans were righteous people. Their flag was the French flag, and it was not a conspiracy against the state or national security, but moreover, a military achievement for them and their fellow citizens.
From now on, La Salle considers Pouvanaa as the nation's #1 enemy.
His political fight was for the people. Nothing but the people. He didn't want his people to be the slaves of foreigners. That was his policy.
In 1947, Pouvanaa advocates the creation of more positions for Polynesian managers, supported by a training policy for young locals. The authorities do not take the idea seriously.
The Tahitian is a big child who could never be trusted at the controls of any social, economic or political machine without resulting in unfortunate consequences.
In fact, most of the governors had made remarks about the Tahitians which were bordering on racist. An inconstant people, a childish people, they are liars, they are fun seekers, they are... Basically, they had all the shortcomings possible. Of course, Pouvanaa could play on this by showing that the governors themselves knew nothing about Tahiti, and most of all, that they were aiming to change the ways of the Tahitian people.
1947 is therefore a decisive turning point. A political conscience awakens, and in the eyes of the indigenous population, Pouvanaa seems to embody the hope for change. In October 1949, the sudden death of Representative Georges Anne sparks early local elections. His opponents represent him as a dangerous communist, making the church and a certain sector of the population wary of him. He's forced to deny the accusations in the press. Despite numerous attacks, he wins the election easily against Reverend Vernier. Thus, Pouvanaa becomes the first Tahitian representative.
The news shakes the authorities. How can this be possible? They hadn't realized that the administration had become so unpopular in the eyes of the Tahitians.
During the state of euphoria following the political victory, and despite the cold welcome that they received from the ruling classes, the Pouvanaa Committee and the Union of Volunteers unite to form the Democratic Assembly of Tahitian Populations, or RDPT. This is the first political party in the territory. The RDPT holds a constitutional congress on the 17th of November 1949. The founder members adopt a manifesto based on a profound change in the relations between France and the territory.
Pouvanaa wants Tahitians in power, and that is his political agenda. There are social and economic battles to fight, but his main policy is for Tahitians to have access to positions as leaders, meaning the creation of a local government. The fight, led by men like Pouvanaa, is to ensure Polynesian citizens gain the same rights as metropolitan French citizens. However, there also is a contradiction with we want to be Tahitian, we want to be recognized as Tahitian, but we still want the same rights as French citizens. It is therefore difficult to address this slight contradiction, which also explains the occasional ambiguity of Pouvanaa and his friend's plight. Although there was a measure of ideology on paper, in practice it was much more about protecting the people, feeding them, providing them with the right equipment, educating their children, etc. Pouvanaa's success was also due to the fact that he remained at grassroots level.
Republican concepts are inevitably changed and reinterpreted once translated into the imagery of the Tahitian language.
Translated into Tahitian, the motto of the Republic, freedom, equality, brotherhood, could be Tiamara, Afaitora, Aute Era. There is no ambiguity in these last two terms. Equality and brotherhood are easy to understand. But the interpretation of the word Tiamara is vague. It could be untarnished, in a physical or moral sense, or mean freedom or even liberation. And it is this ambiguity in meaning that Pouvanaa undeniably plays on by taking the motto of the Republic for his own.
Upon its creation in 1949, Pouvanaa allocates the running of the party to one of his close companions. The administrative management and organisation of the RDPT are under the responsibility of Jean-Baptiste Serran-Jérusalemi. He throws all his energy into creating sections of the party in the districts, businesses, maritime companies, etc. Pouvanaa is charismatic and eloquent. He impresses his listeners. He promises them a collective fight for a destiny, a nation, and emancipation. Pouvanaa created a political life based on religious and biblical culture.
He used the Bible as a permanent reference point and would always revert to it. He knew it inside out. The Tahitians completely understand what he means. The metaphorical and even poetic language he uses greatly annoys certain governors and people in Paris, who find this man very mysterious and not to be taken seriously. But basically, this is a culture shared by Polynesians at the time. It is the way they understand each other when talking about their history and their destiny. After all, the Old Testament speaks of judges, of laws, of kingdoms and battles, and through these references they trace their own history and define history in the making.
In order to rally the followers, the RDPT has its own emblem, the red and white Tahitian flag. And the people found its leader lawmaker. From then on, he was given the name Metua.
The concept of Metua is an interesting one because it means father, and one can only be father to one's own children. Not everyone, not all children. And I think that Pouvanaa was the father of the Tahitians, but he didn't want to be the father of all the people living in French Polynesia. To my mind, he was really a father of a family, of a population who identified with him.
The Metua was in great demand by his people. In 1950, he leaves for France to sit for the first time in the French Parliament. He sees his position as representative akin to a religious crusade to save his people.
Undoubtedly, Pouvanaa's strength lay in the fact that people could identify with him. It is true to say that Pouvanaa was just an ordinary man who spoke Tahitian and didn't speak French very well during the early stages of his career. He was also a humble man who came from a modest background. Therefore, people could both relate to him, yet see something special in him, because a politician can't be ordinary. He must have extraordinary qualities. Perhaps, when looking at his appearance, his unique aura with his mixed origins, he was predestined to belong to those with power. He is the son of a quite influential local district leader, yet he leads a fight for the common people, a fight for born and bred pure Polynesians.
As his popularity grows, so does the exasperation of his detractors. On arrival in 1950, the Governor Petitbon pointed the finger at the troublemakers and small-minded idiots who have adversely affected the natural friendliness of the Tahitians. From this moment, the governor sets out to contain the Pouvanaa phenomena. Successive attempts at destabilizing him had not achieved the desired result. On the 2nd of September 1951, Pouvanaa is re-elected with a clear victory. He gains more than 70% of votes.
1952 was a very troubled year. The RDPT were under the impression that their victory would be stolen from them, since the parties opposing Pouvanaa were lobbying fiercely in Paris for electoral reform, in order to make life difficult for the RDPT. Pouvanaa was advocating breaking ties with France, yet some felt that colonization had a positive side to it and that it was better to work with the money from France than without. So Pouvanaa's fight was more about being than having. Of course, many people see politics in a different light and believe that there must be additional finances, material distribution and benefits to be gained. Pouvanaa's struggle was almost an ethical one, a moral crusade for the population to bear its own burdens without help and to be free. However, it wasn't necessarily everyone's concept of politics. On one occasion, he was invited to a feast with some businessmen and rich folk. He believed that it was a meal and agreed to the invitation. On his arrival, there was a big oval dish on the table. It was covered in a cloth. It was big, really big. And the host said, "Go and eat, there's your food." So he sat down. When he lifted the cloth covering the dish, it wasn't food, but money. So he asked, "Is this food for me?" And they replied, "Yes, eat it all. This money is your food." which really meant, take the money and don't leave a thing, it's yours. He replied, and where is my people's share? Where is the people's share if this is for me? Give to the people too. In that case, give it to everyone. And they didn't know what to say. And that's when they realized that Pouvanaa would not sell his soul. They couldn't buy him. One of Pouvanaa's strong points, one of his fortunes in the end, is that the opponents are very divided. There is no charismatic leader to equal him in the opposition. Therefore, a number of smaller parties start up in the early 1950s without a real figurehead to lead them. It is not until 1956 that Rudy Bambridge, a well-bred man from the wealthiest family in Papeete, appears as a challenger in the elections.
Despite the substantial means that Rudy Bambridge has in his power to lead campaign, Pouvanaa is re-elected representative for the third time. With the same campaign slogans, notably Tahiti for Tahitians, the party continues to win elections until 1957. At the same time, his discourse about the French presence, or at least the civil servants representing it, takes a more radical stance. He also blames the power of money, which according to him is the cause of all trouble. Despite no longer holding official position in the French government, General de Gaulle arrives in Tahiti on the 30th of August 1956 for a short visit. He's welcomed with all the ceremony of a head of state. On the day of his arrival, he makes a somewhat ambiguous speech in which he refers to a new world.
Atomic energy presents mankind with immense possibilities for progress, yet a terrible threat. In today's world, Tahiti, until now distant and isolated, has a certainly important new role to play on the terrestrial globe. One only needs to imagine the perils of the atomic threat hanging over the Earth to see that Tahiti, surrounded by a vast ocean, could be tomorrow's shelter and center of action for civilization as a whole. I hereby stress how strongly I believe that your country should continue its journey with France towards a common destiny of progress, happiness, and greatness.
Tahiti will enter a new world, and this nuclear world, it could be a refuge. But a refuge for who? Is it a refuge for humanity, who could come here if the rest of the world were irradiated? Or would it be a secure refuge for the French atomic bomb experts? That is the ambiguity of General de Gaulle's speech. He is a man with foresight, which means that in 1956, he could not be unaware that Polynesia would be the future experimentation site for the H-bomb.
Que la Polynésie serait le champ d'expérimentation pour la bombe H.
During the same period, the French socialist government would like to see applied the preface to the 1946 Constitution, which gives the populations of overseas territories the possibility of managing their own matters. In this context, the Gaston de Fer law is passed in the French Parliament. Its application promises to give a larger autonomy to the Polynesian representatives. The Governor's Privy Council disappears, and the territory integrates a new institution. A government council made up of ministers. The latter will be voted by the Polynesian Assembly on the 11th of December 1957. Pouvanaa becomes the first vice president of the territorial government of French Polynesia. He holds the second position in the executive body after the governor, who remains the ultimate authority. For the first time since 1880, the year Tahiti and its dependencies were annexed, the Polynesians are involved in the management of their own affairs. But for Pouvanaa, this is not enough. He wants more weight in financial matters. He's in conflict with magistrates and criticizes judicial decision-making. Governor Toby writes about
a frustrating and uncultured man. He refuses to accept French property legislation.
However, in a more confidential context, in a letter to the French Minister of Overseas Affairs, Governor Toubi recognized the fundamental inadaptability of financial legislation in place, regretting that France had not respected its promise at the time of annexation in 1880 to leave affairs of the land in the hands of the indigenous courts. Pouvanaa tirelessly speaks out against unfair decisions and concerns himself with finding out how the common people would be able to pay lawyers' fees. He suggests a return to tumiti, committees of wise men who would make decisions about financial affairs, because in court, he says, it's always the little guy who pays. However, this old war between state representatives and the RDPT does not explain alone the difficult and slow beginnings of the Polynesian government, which is entrusted with the power but has trouble applying the doctrine that it had so adamantly defended for nearly a decade.
Pouvanaa has several weaknesses. One of them is that he is not an educated man, so in comparison with some of his adversaries who are better educated and who know about budgets, Pouvanaa has a weakness, in turn creating, and this is another weakness, a certain amount of competition within his own party. Jean-Baptiste Serran-Jérusalemi, who is close to and mostly faithful to Pouvanaa, is a little more educated. Yet, in some circumstances, feels that Pouvanaa could be an honorary president of the party, but not necessarily the executive chairman.
Within the same government, the Minister of Finance, Henri Baudin, is becoming increasingly concerned that the rate of spending in some departments can only end in the depletion of allocated funds before the end of the year. For budgetary requirements, Serran-Jérusalemi passes a law through Assembly establishing the principle of revenue tax. Before long, there are attacks from the privileged classes, shopkeepers, and anti-RDPT. On the 29th of April 1958, over 3,000 demonstrators invade the streets and take the Territorial Assembly by storm. Trucks filled with rocks and bulldozers are stationed around the Assembly. The building is a target for stoning. Serran-Jérusalemi and Pouvanaa himself are physically threatened. In order to avoid a crescendo of violence, Pouvanaa goes before the rioters and, taking his own side by surprise, announces the cancellation of the project by saying,
"The voice of the people is God's voice. This tax will not be imposed."
However, this last-minute waiver is not enough to calm overheated tempers. When evening comes, the more threatening demonstrators go to Pouvanaa's house, which becomes the target of another stoning.
Pouvanaa files a complaint, yet nothing happens, nothing at all. He goes to see the state prosecutor, goes to see the governor, and nothing is done, despite evidence that could enable them to question certain individuals. In fact, no inquiry is held whatsoever.
The day following this popular uprising, under the insistence of the governor and central government agents, the adversaries of the RDPT managed to group together to form the Tahitian Democratic Union. Returning as head of state on the 1st of June 1958, General de Gaulle immediately proposes organising a referendum to consult the French populations about his project for a new constitution. For French Polynesia, there's a great deal at stake. The application of this constitution will allow the populations of overseas collectives to choose their status after referendum towards a more or less greater autonomy. Recommendations from Paris are very explicit. Firstly, Polynesia must vote for. Secondly, it is imperative that it should choose the status overseas territory, therefore tying it to the Republic.
In a perhaps rather odd rhetoric for the Cartesian mind of a Westerner, Pouvanaa says he's not against General de Gaulle. In a very formalistic way, he states that General de Gaulle is giving him the opportunity to vote for or against. This means a vote against is not against General de Gaulle, but for the possibility of him giving you the opportunity to do so. And in this way, he presents himself as a friend or close collaborator of General de Gaulle. He always held General de Gaulle in great esteem, yet historically it didn't go both ways.
The administration provides those who vote for with logistical support, primarily in the form of boats owned by the army or the state. The gendarmerie help in an inconspicuous but effective manner.
The authorities collude very strongly. The 1958 administration is clearly biased. Pouvanaa is really alone, yet he triumphs in a few islands where he actually manages to lead his campaign and where people can gauge the strength of his courage. There were obstacles everywhere he went, blocking his way. He went to the islands on a fishing boat, a simple fishing boat. That's right, he led his campaign from a fishing boat. He was exceptionally brave. Tuahine was the mayor of Taha. He had money, and he allowed Pouvanaa and his team to use his boat for their travels during the referendum campaign. The administrator, Scipion, was angry because Tuahine had accepted to carry Pouvanaa on his boat. I don't know if orders came from the governor or not, but a military boat came to the quay in Taha. Some soldiers got off while we were in church. At the end of Mass, the soldiers lined up on the quayside right up to the road and from the shop to the school. They pointed their guns at Tuahine because he had let Pouvanaa use his boat. The administrator asked Tuahine, "Why did you accept Pouvanaa as a passenger?" He answered, "I respect him because he's a dignitary. He is a member of parliament. I gave him my boat for nothing."
The churches also break their silence to call people to vote for. The Catholic and Protestant church leaders speak out against Pouvanaa on public radio, calling for a yes to France vote, yes to keeping Polynesia French. Despite the attacks and the obstacles in his way, Pouvanaa spares no effort trying to convince his people to follow him.
He said to the people, "You mustn't hold on to the car." He was comparing himself to a moving car, asking his people not to get in the way or slow him down. It was as if people were hesitating.
On the evening of 28th of September 1958, the for vote wins easily with 64% of ballots. It is Pouvanaa's first electoral defeat since 1949. He remains vice president of the government, but his power is called into question. The very next day, the newspapers publish articles debating whether
Pouvanaa should be thrown out of Polynesia, be prohibited from residence, and lose his French nationality.
the political authorities search for a quick means of removing him permanently before the Assembly pronounces its stance on the status to be adopted in 4 months' time.
The aim is to stop Pouvanaa from proposing a status that would not suit the French government. By observing the chain of events and reading the telegrams sent to the Prime Minister, it is strikingly easy to see that there is a simple chronology. When the governor receives the order to use everything in his power to stop Pouvanaa, by pure coincidence, Pouvanaa is arrested for attempted arson in the 24 hours that follow.
The governor can do as he sees fit. His aim is to ensure that the Assembly, made up of a majority of RDPT deputies, retains the overseas territory status. Paris orders the suspension of either the Government Council or its Vice President. Yet on what grounds? This would start trouble brewing across the territory.
Pouvanaa's supporters barricade themselves in his quarters. Rumors fly about what might happen. This makes the atmosphere very difficult in the days following the referendum. The governor seizes the opportunity and declares that public order is under threat. I will therefore suspend the Government Council. The governor never questions the responsibility of Pouvanaa's opponents for the agitation. They are not prosecuted. They have stones and bulldozers and are closing in around Pouvanaa's home, but that doesn't seem to matter. I asked Pouvanaa to leave his confinement and come with me, but he never wanted to. He never accepted. He wanted to stay with his people, with his folk. And in fact, Pouvanaa knows that something is going on, that there is a plot against him. Tempers are fraying amongst his friends, people are drinking a lot of coffee, no one can sleep, and anything can happen in this kind of atmosphere.
During the night of the 9th of October, there is a sudden wave of panic. Militia are patrolling the streets.
That night, I was at Pouvanaa's house, around 8 or 9 o'clock. It was late. I went up to bed, and Pouvanaa was in the hall, on his way to his room, which was there, and Lola's room, where I slept, was there too. And I said, I'm going to bed. I was tired. And as I went upstairs, there was a boy called Alexis. I don't know what. He was behind Pouvanaa, and I heard him say, and I'll say it in Tahitian, because this is exactly what he said. He called him Ru'au, because that's how they addressed him. He said, Te Ru'au, na whea, haere tutu I te oeri, which means, hey old man, how can we set fire to the town? Pouvanaa turned round and said, I'm tired of your way of doing things. If you want to go and set fire to the town, then go, but don't blame me for it. And then he turned round, and I was behind him. I was about a metre away, you see. There's always a light on in our house, and it looked like no one was in. So I go in, and I hear, hey, stay out. I say, I'm going to bed, it's my house. There were guards on the gate to the entrance of our courtyard. Then one of them asks, O vai oe, who are you? And I say, no te whare, it's my house. I went into the house and they didn't say any more. Inside, there was a sort of gasoline smell. It was the first time I'd smelt that. And I saw the stones neatly lined up on the stairs. The stones that we were going to use to finish our terrace. They'd all been picked up and arranged on the stairs. Everyone was there, and it was only afterwards that we in fact realised that some of the people also there that evening were much closer to the other political parties. Among them was also that Alexis man, and we knew that they had never supported Pouvanaa. So what were they doing there?
On the 10th of October, at dawn, the police surround the house. Pouvanaa is asked to surrender.
He was dressed in his scarf with his badge. And he went out front. He stayed there for a while because people were praying for him. The police respected that. And after that, they saw him off down the main road in the armoured car. Not long after that, it was my turn to be taken away. There was Fifi's sister, her husband, and me as witnesses in the house during the search. I just stood there, and they searched the place. Well, I wouldn't call it a real search, because they went here and there. For example, upstairs, they go straight into my uncle's room, look under the bed, and find 2 shotguns under the bed. I say, they're not ours. How did they get into our house? And then they go into my room, head straight for a big seashell, and he turns it over like that, and the bullets fall out. I say, no way, those bullets aren't mine. How come they're in my room? Then they head straight for my grandfather's room opposite. And there's a book on the dresser. I found out later what it was. And when they open it, they find porn photos. In fact, they only searched a few places without looking everywhere and found all of those things straight off. When they came to arrest him, I was at home with my parents and my brothers and sisters. Our house was just across from Pouvanaa's. And we heard soldiers early in the morning. A lot of soldiers with guns surrounded the whole neighbourhood. I don't know if there were bullets in them, but they came and surrounded us. We couldn't move. They said, "You sit there, stay calm and don't move." Then we saw Pouvanaa come down, escorted by the gendarmes. However, one thing I noticed was that a van appeared. And on the right side, a gendarme got out. And he went straight to some land next to Pouvanaa's. There was some wasteland next to it with a tumuuru, a breadfruit tree. He went over, bent down, scratched the earth for 1 or 2 seconds, and pulled out a Molotov cocktail bottle. My mother, standing next to me, said, "That's not right. The police captain went straight over. He already knew there was a bottle there." I was only 18. I was a minor. In those days, you were an adult at 21. But I would have loved to have been able to say what I saw with my own eyes.
The idea is to ensure that those who are to try Pouvanaa have no moral qualms about judging him this time. The key is to portray him as a heinous character. Thus, a psychological unit is set up within both the secret services and the army to launch a propaganda campaign that will present Pouvanaa in the most despicable light possible. Pouvanaa's friends are also put under a lot of pressure, and they are so frightened that they go to the extent of showing a wave of patriotism in the assembly in stating, "We will never separate from France," which is how Pouvanaa's friends start abandoning him.
Since the pro-France vote had won, the representatives had to adopt the future status of French Polynesia within 4 months.
Therefore, they commonly agree to remain an overseas territory. But what sort of specific status would it have? Which is where Pouvanaa's opponents came in. Gérald Copenrath, who seems to say, "We've just experienced dramatic events because we rushed into autonomy, so now we have to revert to a less political way. We should settle for just administrating affairs, hand more power back to the governor, ensure that the government council only deal with current land ownership affairs, and avoid government politicization."
On the 23rd of December 1958, General de Gaulle signs an act, thus cancelling the Gaston Defferre law. The position of Vice President is abolished. The ministers lose their titles, retaining only their collegial powers. The governor is once again the most powerful man in the territory. In October 1959, Pouvanaa and 40 other defendants are sentenced after some months of incriminating investigation.
On reading the file, one realises that a few days beforehand, there is actually a quite shady character who reports the incident, what happened that night, and who gently pushes Pouvanaa into making a mistake. That's the impression that you get in any case when you read the file.
In reality, the town was never set on fire. There were 2 or 3 petrol bombs thrown at 2 or 3 houses in Papeete, and that's it. It didn't go any further, and Pouvanaa was asleep in his bed that evening. End of story. Were the petrol bombs put in his house by his enemies, who were trying to get him to fall into a trap? Were the bottles there as defense in the event of an attack? That is the biggest question.
This is a very serious accusation, as the charges brought against Pouvanaa and the other defendants are seen as criminal offences, referred to the criminal courts. This means that the crimes they're being prosecuted for are punishable by the death penalty. Despite the grave nature of the case, the proceedings contain several judicial aberrations. From the outset, the circumstances surrounding the arrest take neither his parliamentary immunity or the presumption of innocence into account. Another legal issue is the total disregard of the right to appeal. This allows for a second hearing of the case in order to guarantee a more neutral judgment. But here, the 2 aforementioned hearings are under the jurisdiction of only one man, René Bonneau. He is a magistrate who in the past has had many heated disagreements with Pouvanaa about land issues.
What is all very interesting is that the decision to arrest Pouvanaa was made in the governor's office and not the public prosecutors, whereas normally it's the public prosecutor who is responsible for public action and not the governor or today's equivalent of High Commissioner in French Polynesia.
The correspondence between the governor and the minister reveals that the deputy was to be convicted at all costs. The first option was for the trial to be moved to France.
Urgent. Find solution for immediate waiver of parliamentary immunity. Provide for case in French Assize Court with land jury. Forcible conviction will render individual concerned ineligible. Signed, Bruno.
However, Edmond Michelet, the Minister of Justice, has considerable reservations. He's not convinced by the arguments favouring the representative's guilt.
The file is empty. The case would evidently be dismissed, and only electoral reasons appear to justify the Tahitians' deprivation of liberty.
The decision is finally made. The trial will be held in Tahiti without further delay. The requests for appeal by Maître Richcoeur, Pouvanaa's lawyer, are all dismissed. It seems that the die are cast for good. His lawyer remarks,
Pouvanaa, you're like an egg that has been fried before being laid.
The trial opens on the 19th of October 1959 in the courthouse in Papeete. A strong police presence and a high level of security are in place to avoid any potential uprising. Pouvanaa appears tired and thinner after a year in prison. He's wearing his tricolour representative scarf.
What's more, all the proceedings were in French. He was the only one speaking in Tahitian, so there was quite a delay, and it wasn't easy to translate Pouvanaa into French, especially when he was using biblical terms.
Papeete was never set on fire. It was the hearts of my political enemies that were set on fire by my words.
The prosecutor develops a damning indictment, openly expressing very personal judgments of values and making disparaging comments aimed at the representative, even comparing him to the Emperor Nero, who had Rome burnt. Except for the fact that, unlike Nero, Pouvanaa is not mad. He must therefore be considered as wholly responsible for his acts. However, the reasons for the charges brought against him were revised, or in other words, minimized, during the course of the trial.
This means that the initial charges against him would be lessened in order to avoid risking the death penalty. After all, it would be going too far to sentence an old man who was in his bed that evening to death. And thus, everyone realizes that Pouvanaa has fallen into a trap. Whose doing was this? It was quite an elaborate scheme.
Maître Richcoeur, the defense lawyer, addresses the jury, underlining the qualities of the Metua as a peaceful and just man. He wants them to be conscious of the political consequences that will result from the verdict.
Later you will deliver a verdict that I could qualify as historical for a small territory. Do not forget, sirs, that if the accused were to die in prison, you would be giving them what is missing from their plight, a martyr.
Here we have a situation where really no one cares about what actually happens. In fact, guilty or innocent, they want him convicted because something must be done in French Polynesia. So, in that respect, I suppose one can speak of colonial justice when referring to the Pouvanaa trial.
After 3 days of trial and only 2 hours of deliberation, the court issues its verdict on the 21st of October at 9 p.m. Pouvanaa à Oopa is sentenced to 8 years of imprisonment with a 15-year ban on entry to his country.
We must not forget that Pouvanaa was already 63 years old at the time of his trial, and by sentencing him in such a harsh manner, he was basically condemned never to return to French Polynesia again.
It is important to understand that Pouvanaa was excluded by what I'd call a combination of two powers. Firstly, there was the state, which had state interest at heart, which were undoubtedly the future CEP, the nuclear testing site in the Pacific. There were also Pouvanaa's opponents who were very frightened locally. One can only imagine being in their position to understand how terrified they must have been. They probably saw independence as the road to absolute poverty, and most of all for themselves. Of course, Pouvanaa had frightened them, and their reaction when they saw him weaken during the 1958 referendum was, "This man must be brought down, he's far too dangerous." One of the political leaders at the time had told me, "You know, it is true that we were hard on Pouvanaa, but you must realize that if Pouvanaa had stayed in Polynesia, we would never have been able to do the business we've done today." And the man speaking was very rich, so it is important to understand that Pouvanaa was a victim, not only on account of state interests, but also the interest of Polynesia's wealthy.
On the 15th of March 1960, a few weeks after the suspension of his mandate as representative, Pouvanaa is taken out to sea on the east coast of Tahiti in the middle of the night by a patrol boat and transferred to the vessel Le Caledonia.
At one point, he hit the boat, and his handicap following the incident appears to have come from that. Some of our compatriots behaved very badly towards Pouvanaa, and that hurts. That hurts because he was wounded, and no one cared for him.
In Tahiti, the new governor Siku tries his hardest to reassert his full authority as chief of the executive and to make people forget the Metua. He has substantial resources at his disposal in order to do so. He sets up a political and psychological unit aimed at organizing anti-Pouvanaa propaganda and regaining control of the inhabitants.
Following the Pouvanaa trial, there is an aftershock. People are afraid that the same thing will happen to them. You're in your bed, you say something, you have people all around you, and then you find yourself far away for 15 years of imprisonment.
Pouvanaa was incarcerated in Baumet's prison in Marseille, then in Fresnes. He remains there 15 months before he's called to the bedside of his son, Maté, the son he had sent to war, who had succeeded him in his position as representative and who had become very ill.
He was at the hospital. He was allowed to go and be with his son. And he stayed. He stayed by his side until he died.
Pouvanaa's state of health is very much affected by the ordeal. He leaves the prison at 67 years old. He is then assigned residence in the north of Paris.
At Pierrefonds, Pouvanaa accepts the punishment given, not because he finds it fair. I think he was deeply shocked and he fought for the rest of his life thereafter against the trial and to rebuild himself. He accepts it just as another ordeal to endure. He tried to rationalize it by using his religious beliefs, by saying to himself, if my Creator has imposed such suffering on me, then I have to endure it to show how strong I am, and that will make me come back even stronger.
Since General de Gaulle's return to power in the Fifth Republic on the 1st of June 1958, the nuclear testing program had accelerated considerably. The government of the Fifth Republic intends to put all its energy into leading the program. But the general is also interested in Pouvanaa's conditions of residence. He orders the Minister of Internal Affairs to keep him under discreet surveillance.
It is vitally important to prevent Pouvanaa from leaving France. He can easily reach Tahiti by crossing the French border illegally and boarding a foreign airline for Papeete. However, his anti-nationalist behavior would have disastrous consequences on French interests, and above all, on the future atomic experimentation, which from now on should be held in Pacific waters.
In 1962, 4 years after his arrest, the Assembly representatives unanimously agree that the Metua should be freed. A few weeks later, a Polynesian delegation of deputies leaves for France to request a 5-year aid scheme due to the catastrophic economic situation of the territory. General de Gaulle presents his nuclear experimentation site as the long-term solution to their financial problems.
They are very impressed. And on reflection, they realize that perhaps it is a solution. What is noticeable when looking at the newspapers, when the councillors came back from Paris, is that when they arrive and are crowned with flowers, they are beaming from ear to ear. They certainly don't appear worried. In fact, quite the opposite. They are returning with plenty of money and the promise of a steady cash flow. All is well. In other words, it was a clever move to sweeten up the councillors and arrange things so that they would eventually benefit from the result of the nuclear testing site. Polynesia's political classes no longer represented the common people, as the RDPT had done before.
However, Pouvanaa is still hoping that together the population will strongly oppose the decision. The party must continue to fight for independence and demand a referendum.
Here, the governor and the government would use an article dating back to 1936, which states that no one has the right to ask for the independence of a piece of French territory. As Polynesia chose to remain French in 1958, it does not have the right to request independence. At least, that is what the legal experts of the time thought. Hence, on the strength of the 1936 article, the RDPT and Serran-Jérusalem's party, the PTM, are disbanded. his entire framework is destroyed, and if two RDPT leaders so much as meet and are seen in conversation in the street, they can be accused of reforming a disbanded league. Therefore, the measure has very serious consequences, which led to the annihilation of the party. In fact, any possibility of opposing the nuclear testing site was thus excluded.
At the same time, Pouvanaa is transferred to the Gare region. He's cut off from any contact with Tahiti from that point onwards. The question is where Pouvanaa will be the least harmful.
I was supposed to look for funding for the budget. In the face of a 20 million franc deficit, the Assembly decided to send me to France to beg for money from the Ministry of French Overseas Territories. I was met on arrival at the Élysée by one of the ex-governors here, who had been Focal's chief of staff. He greeted me kindly and said, "The general wants to see you." So I go in and I'm introduced to the General de Gaulle, who says, "My dear friend," etc. I listen to him. He has no time to spare. He makes it clear that he needs these atolls for atomic testing, and that it would be better if we gave them to France. And that if we did not, he would have the means of forcing us to do so. For example, he said, "I need this territory. I need its location, and I could simply name a military government and declare Polynesia a strategical zone." So I was a little surprised by these words, and I didn't have an answer at the time. But afterwards I thought about it a great deal, and there was no question of discussion. He was there to tell me what he wanted, what he wished for the grandeur of France. And de Gaulle told me, "We will find a way of improving Polynesian society's living conditions. Don't worry about that."
While the construction of the Moruroa and Whangatofa bases has already been underway for a year, the financial problem still remains unsolved.
By all rights, the question of Moruroa's leasing should have been debated in the Assembly. Yet the fear of voters' reactions pushed politicians into leaving the decision in the hands of the Permanent Commission.
On the 6th of February 1964, the Commission Permanente of the Territorial Assembly was held. The debate didn't focus on the implementation of the CEP or otherwise, but on the nature of the lease. Jacques-Denis Drolet argued for a free-of-charge lease for an undetermined period.
I said that we were making a sacrifice and that we hoped that the French state would never forget. I hope they won't forget that. Then Jacques-Denis Drolet concedes by saying, "At heart, I have taken my responsibilities. I wanted to save French Polynesia from becoming a military zone, and I faced up to my responsibilities where others have chosen to hide."
At the time when I had my restaurant, several French people came to tell me that they knew the man was a hero, that he was stubborn, and that is why he was tricked. His project was not to happen, but their own project had to.
The first nuclear strike took place on the 2nd of July 1966 above the atoll of Moruroa. The bomb was of low intensity, reads the headline in a dépêche. For Pouvanaa, the period of imprisonment was coming to an end in the October of that year. However, on the 23rd of February 1966, his sentence was reduced. He is only free, relatively speaking, as he is prohibited from the whole of the French Pacific territories.
In 1966, I was able to spend a day with him. And if there is one thing that I remember about my conversation with him that day, it's that he was thinking about his return. Would people still support him or not on his return after everything he had done for them? For my people to be far from me would be intolerable. I cannot imagine them being distant. I want to be close to my people. As he spoke, there were tears in his eyes. In Paris, I meet Sicurani, who says, come tomorrow morning and you'll get a nice surprise. I go to the hotel and I find a letter from Alec Atta. In the letter, Alec Atta warns me about the French government's behavior, wanting to make Pouvanaa adopt departmentalization. The delegate had a sitting room. He opens the door, and who do I see but Pouvanaa? He says to me, well, I want you to do everything and sort it all out so that Polynesia becomes a département.
La Polynésie devienne un département.
And I say, but hold on, I was expecting you to ask for independence. That's what you've always wanted. But now, you want a département? Being a département is the total opposite of independence. I don't understand you. Who is asking you? Who is telling you to ask to be a département? And he answers, it is because I'm fed up of being here and I want to go home. So I say, but I just don't understand you. Te Ariki is there at the Palais Bourbon, and that's where you have to ask for being a département. Have you asked Te Ariki? He says, yes, I have asked. And he doesn't want to. Do you think I would want to? Yes. You'll do it because I'm asking you, and you have a good relationship with the French government, because you gave Moruroa and Fangataufa to France. The future was marked out, clearly mapped out. I replied, yes, it's possible, but I won't do it. He said, what's your problem? Are you too proud? I looked straight at him and I said, no, that's not it. It's simply because, as a matter of principle, I don't want to. Because changing status from our current one to the status of a département would be considered to be a step backwards and therefore an abandon of our principles. So he showed his discontent by saying, you don't understand. You haven't understood that only I can save the country.
Despite many attempts by politicians seeking presidential clemency, only one letter managed to convince the general. On the 3rd of June 1968, the day of his ordination, a young bishop named Michel Copenrath wrote a letter to the President of the Republic of France.
Since 1959, Pouvanaa Oopa, ex-representative for French Polynesia, has been in exile in France. His sentence has been reduced to a mere refusal of entry into the country. I believe that the whole of French Polynesia would be grateful for a gesture of clemency on your part, which would return the Metua to his homeland, Polynesia. Once again, Mr. President, please do not see my request as a passionate or political one, or a light-hearted one, but simply the desire of a new bishop of Papeete, ordained this very day, to lessen the suffering of one man and help appease spirits.
Pouvanaa was 73 years old. If he were to die in exile, he would become a martyr, and that was something the government did not wish for.
The General de Gaulle uses the 50th year anniversary of the signing of the armistice on the 11th of November 1968 as an opportunity. To celebrate it, there could be presidential grace. The event was a dramatic date which corresponded well with an act of clemency because France is generous towards its war veterans. However, in actual fact, it was time to do away with the Pouvanaa case, now that he was less of a threat since the nuclear testing had been done and the figure was getting old and not really capable of leading a protest movement anymore.
There were a lot of people, but he was so happy when he saw his country, and he said, "Oh, my beloved mountain."
The atmosphere at the airport was electric. People were so pleased to get Pouvanaa back. He had trouble walking, but I can still see him as very dignified, and I thought of what he'd said to me in Paris, how his people would welcome him if they would still accept him. I think that as soon as he arrived, he was convinced that his people were still behind him.
There were so many people, but no one could get near him. It was, I don't know, I think I even had tears in my eyes.
On the 30th of November 1968, after 9 years in exile, the Metua lived the moment he had waited for so long. To rousing applause and covered in flower garlands, the open-top car left the aerodrome, heading for Papeete Town Hall, where a welcoming ceremony had been prepared. In his first speech after 10 years of imposed silence, he calls for the parties to unite. Many times he refers to our mother country. Then, for over an hour, he's greeted, crowned with flowers, and kissed by those who he still calls my children. The Metua proclaims his innocence and asks for justice to be done.
I would like for my case to be re-examined, and I want to be cleared of all accusations made against me since 1942. I am innocent. I feel neither hate nor bitterness. France is a great nation and will render me justice.
On the political scene, his long absence had allowed other characters to come to the forefront.
In 1968, Pouvanaa wants to return to political life, yet the space is already filled by those who had replaced him. John Teariki willingly accepts to step down for Pouvanaa's benefit. He is close to Pouvanaa and asks for nothing in return, I think. But nonetheless, he was elected representative, and there was also Francis Sanfort, who was a rising figure, who was actually quite soft at the time, as he had been administratively close for a long period to the governors. They became closer, friends and partners in their fight a little later.
He received amnesty for his sentence in July 1969, and Pouvanaa was eligible once again. In 1971, he's candidate for the autonomous groups. He's elected senator on the 26th of September 1971. By allowing him this victory, his peers offer him a symbolic recovery. They see him as the father of a fight for Tahitian sovereignty. He's also a strong, in fact the strongest defender of the Tahitian language. In 1973, then 1975, he proposes a law concerning the organisation of teaching of spoken cultures and languages in the overseas territories. Francis Sanfort and John Teariki lead the movement towards an evolution of the statute based upon autonomist and anti-nuclear stands. In 1973, 10 years after the beginnings of the CEP, the first public anti-nuclear demonstration is held in the streets of Papeete. A French delegation made up of politicians, religious authorities and militant ecologists are there. At the front of the crowd, leading the march, is Pouvanaa, in his wheelchair.
It really is a fight that he never could have imagined in his early days. Pouvanaa was a fisherman, a farmer, a carpenter battling for social justice, for widows and orphans. And now, here he is fighting nuclear power. He is both sad to be leading such an unfair fight, yet at the same time very proud to still be on the scene and leading the demonstrators.
Negotiations about status start in 1975 with the Overseas Secretary of State, Olivier Stern. The tractations spark extreme discontent among the autonomists under the United Front banner. Their fury leads them to demand the disbandment of the Assembly. A power struggle begins. The institution is blocked for 10 months. The political crisis has not yet been resolved, when on 10th of January 1977, at the age of 82, the Senator Pouvanaa a Oopa passes away.
Everyone was there. I think that there have only been 2 or 3 funerals like that in Polynesia where there has been such a crowd. From the town hall in Papeete to Paufai, I think the whole seafront was packed.
Elected on the 29th of May 1977, the new autonomist majority at the Assembly approves the final version of the statute. On the 12th of July 1977, Francis Sanfort and the President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing ratified the territory of French Polynesia's status of autonomous management. He was born the year of the annexation of his island, Huahine. He passed away the year that the territory is granted autonomous management. He closed his eyes before seeing it in practice. He left while continuing to claim his innocence, without being heard. He was granted amnesty, given grace, but in the eyes of the law, the error remains. Pouvanaa is still charged as guilty of wanting to burn down Papeete.
Pouvanaa, representative in Papeete, Tahiti. You were imprisoned and you returned. In saying this, the God Jehovah lives within me. You have helped your people to live, despite the domination of merchants and businessmen. Thanks to you, the men with the right and just words, thanks to you we are here, to continue to show the truth about all you have suffered and withstood until the moment you left this world.